ところに来たわね。もうすぐ実験が始まるわ。
Tsutomu Nihei is a strange author. His works are strange, yes, but the more you dig into his life, the more it seems like his career was just a happy accident. Though you can easily see from his art that Nihei has oodles of talent, manga wasn't necessarily something that was inherently inside him. And yet, despite this, his first serialized manga, Blam, is considered by many as a masterpiece. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. The more I learned about the creation of Blam, the more I came to the realization that it too was, in a way, serendipitous. Growing up, Nihei didn't have a particular inclination to draw manga. At the time, in the 80s and 90s, Shonen Jump was in its golden age, and like most other kids growing up at the time, he read and was familiar with it. Other than this though, he wasn't an avid manga reader. His school library had some science fiction collections which interested him, but otherwise, that was about it. These seemingly small influences, however, would have a profound effect and develop his later aesthetic. Nihei also says that he was inspired by Blade Runner and Gundam models, which were beginning to take off when he was younger. The Gundam may have been an early inspiration for his future Knights of Sidonia series. Nihei was also immensely inspired by the works of Swiss artist H.R. Geiger, whose biopunk aesthetics can be seen clearly throughout Nihei's manga. In his early years, nothing really called to him, and so he didn't have any particular career path that he wanted to follow. And it was only in his 20s, when the manga scene was booming, that he even considered drawing manga as a career path. In fact, he only chose to study architecture because his high school was an architectural school, and his father was a carpenter. Later, in his 20s, after working in construction for a while as a site supervisor and also making construction drawings, he came to the realization that this just wasn't for him. He felt that in construction he needed to work well with others and work in groups to get things done properly, and he thought he just wasn't suited to working for an organization. So he decided to give manga drawing a shot. He quit his job and headed to New York, where he studied at the Parsons School of Design and drew in his free time. He says he wasn't taking his studies super seriously, as he was only trying to make it as a manga artist, and so he would occasionally goof off with other Asian transfer students. After a year abroad, he would move back to Japan, unfortunately having made very little progress toward his goal. He sent out a bunch of his work to Jump and Young Magazine and a ton of other publishers, but unfortunately none of it was picked up. After coming back to Japan, he asked a friend what else he should try, and the friend recommended he send his work to Afternoon, which he did, and got a phone call right away. Afternoon magazine gave him the Special Jury Prize in 1995 for some of his earlier work, but it wouldn't be until 1997, 2 years later, that they would give him his own series, which would become his famed manga, Blam. In the meantime, for 5 months he worked as an assistant to Tsutomu Takahashi, who was doing Jirashin for Afternoon. Nihei says working under Takahashi helped him greatly, as he was still new to drawing manga, and this gave him the technical know-how he was still missing. Blam, which began publishing in 1997 in Afternoon magazine, was Tsutomu Nihei's first series, and I believe his magnum opus. I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue otherwise. To create Blam, he drew inspiration from masterworks of science fiction, but also his work in construction. Nihei, in an interview, said, "My experience working in construction might have played a big part. Watching buildings get built, the heavy machinery coming in and digging out those giant spaces. I do think the sheer scale of all that must have influenced me in some vague way. But it's more than just the scale. I think it's also influenced me in the details of my manga." There was a time after coming back to Japan that I was working part-time for an architectural design firm, and I learned about how the insides of walls are structured, that kind of thing. So for example, buildings over 10 stories high are made with steel framing inside, and now I know how they're structured, or how the piping works, and I can draw that stuff without having to look at anything for reference. Clearly, his time in construction and design helped and influenced him in his work. He was also inspired by sci-fi works like Blade Runner, which he watched in junior high school, and of course the enormously influential Ghost in the Shell and Akira, just to name a few. These monuments of sci-fi and cyberpunk worlds held a magnitude of power that rivaled any other media at the time. They created, within the minds of so many, a wild inspiration that would be cited as influencing so many other works. Clearly, Tsutomu's interests and inspiration led him to make a sci-fi cyberpunk work, but one which was so unique and so extraordinary as to itself become a touchstone of manga. Now, Blam, despite being so prevalent, is also divisive. One of its unique attributes is its lack of dialogue, or really any plot at all. This wasn't completely an intentional decision by Nihei, as he confesses he was not used to writing stories, and so relied more on visual storytelling. But I personally think the lack of story adds to the immense atmosphere of Blam. Although I understand that this isn't for everyone, especially those just looking for a traditional storyline. Blam is so quintessentially itself and so uncompromising in its vision that it can alienate the reader. But for those who persevere, I think it's a world unto itself, like nothing else I've ever read.
Hajimaru wa.
The works of Nihei begin, like all great SF works, with cognitive estrangement, a feeling of unrest and disorientation due to a novum, a new thing. Nihei takes this disorientation almost to its limits, describing a world not just change, such as a future Earth ravaged by apocalypse, but a world wholly reformed and utterly foreign to us. His world building relies immensely on architecture and space to create a setting which oozes atmosphere and is at the forefront of this disorientation that he creates. The first layer of his disorientation begins with immateriality, a world like ever-changing dunes composed of shifting sands. We first see the immateriality of the city through the warping and decay of matter. In his thesis, Code Ferran gives us a great example of this immateriality. Quote, "A sequence from Volume 3, page 192, shows Sibo and Killy standing on a large platform that fades into the distance. Its appearance in terms of materiality is much the same as other significant settings of the series. Yet the very first panel of this sequence illustrates the ground turning soft with an audible squish. Sibo notes this and states, 'The matter has started to warp.' The two characters leave the setting with haste, implying that warping matter is an added danger. The implication is that among everything else, that the very fabric of reality in the city is mutable and subject to physical disorientation." End quote. We also see the gravitational shifts emphasizing even more the changing states of matter and space, ever in flux. These changes in matter and space create the first disorientation of impermanence and immateriality, creating a sense in the reader that nothing is permanent. These fluctuations create an uneasy feeling that nothing is as it seems. If the first disorientation creates a sense of unease, the second amplifies it tenfold: the incomprehensibility of space and time. At one point within the city, Killy encounters a room 143,000 kilometers in diameter. To put that in perspective, the diameter of Earth is roughly 13,000 kilometers. This single room is larger than the largest planet in our solar system, the gas giant Jupiter. 1,300 Earths it could easily contain. Knowing this, the city could more easily be classified as a celestial body. The rough size of the city is said to be analogous to the orbit of Jupiter around the Sun, a diameter of 1.6 billion kilometers. This is the structure that Killy is journeying through, trying to find a single person with the net terminal gene. One person in unfathomable miles of tunnel. On another panel, we casually turn the page to see a text box which states 2,244,096 hours later. That, my friends, is 93,504 days, just a little over 256 years. We just witnessed the passing of 256 years in between two panels. Now think of the implications of these few pages. What inky blackness is hiding planetary spaces, and between which two panels is the passing of millennia? Talk about disorientation. No horizon, no points of reference, no sunrise or sunset, simply endless hallways and stairwells, endless traversing through endless time. And it's essentially endless, because we know that Killy is not human. If he's been traveling for hundreds of years just between these two pages, then we know that he is immortal or near immortal. He's able to move massive blocks of concrete with ease and can be sent flying through several thick walls and still get up to fight. And no matter how severe the injury, even when he loses almost half his body mass, Killy can regenerate the lost tissue over time. Killy is beyond superhuman, and yet it seems even he is barely making a dent. The city is far from human capability. This brings us to the penultimate disorientation: the lack of story, or I should say, the lack of progress. From the very beginning, we are thrown into a strange new world with no points of reference and no context. Very slowly, we begin to piece together a narrative thread, but this almost never manifests into a narrative arc. We are simply watching Killy's long, protracted journey through a horror-infested wasteland, trying to find a human with a net terminal gene. And this wasteland is itself the final disorientation. The sterility of the city is uncanny. It is devoid of all life except the horrifying safeguards and plethora of silicon life, seemingly all of which are antagonistic to our main character. Except for these, there seems to be very little else. No animals, no grass or greenery, no sky, just vast landscapes of wires and pipes and machinery, all artificial. And within this vast area are the occasional small bastions of humanity, subsisting barely in a space not meant for human living. In fact, it is actively detrimental to it. The architecture of Blam is squared, cubic, hard-edged. The only spheres used are in character design. The humans and the biological, as well as the other inhabitants of the city, have circular features, but in the world surrounding, they are nigh impossible to find. In the early chapters, we see these statues in the form of humans, but this would be the last, as any other forms of organic architecture are quickly hunted out by Nihei. The city's disorientation, in human scale, its sterility, immateriality, sentience, and hostility, are all factors that produce a city that is unrecognizable as a contemporary human-scaled city. Nihei's philosophy of the space he has created is unquestionably dystopian to the nth degree. Nihei's architecture shows a distinct opposition to humans, his world being utterly antagonistic to their survival. It does not take into consideration even the basic foundations of architecture for humans, let alone the neuroarchitecture, but goes in the complete opposite direction. Neuroarchitecture being the interdisciplinary field of neuroscience and design to create a stress-free environment and promote well-being. Now, with everything we've already discussed, this is pretty laughable. In the case of Blam, we know very clearly that Nihei isn't taking into consideration the well-being of the city's inhabitants. If Nihei is considering neuroarchitecture at all, then it would be so that he could reverse each tenet and create a wholly antithetical world, a world that is the farthest you could get from stress-free. In fact, let's consider some of the principles of neuroarchitecture and see for ourselves. Some are a little hard to judge, but let's try our best. We first have temperature. A well-balanced temperature is important for creating comfortable surroundings, given that our brain is very sensitive to sudden temperature changes, which may impede cognitive performance and, on an emotional level, result in hostility. Although we don't have an exact understanding of the temperature within the city, we can probably assume that it's not placed within the ideal temperature for the human body. I find it hard to believe that within something the size of the city, there is a sufficient heating or cooling system, or HVAC system, if you will. Next, we have lighting. Insufficient lighting can affect our circadian rhythms, but the level and temperature of the color also affect our mood and activity levels. While an intense white light activates our brain, warm light is shown to reduce stress. This goes with one other principle: color. Each color acts on a different area of our brain and affects our mood. Thanks to science, we have discovered that pink calms our nerves and reduces anger, while warm colors improve productivity and concentration, making them ideal for work environments. The lighting within the city is shown to be minimal to non-existent. This in turn affects any colors that may be present, but for the most part, all we see are garish grays and other concrete-like tones, creating a consistently bland environment, like that of a factory. Of course, Blam is in black and white, but on the cover arts that are colored, we can easily see these gray tones. Far from easing our minds, the lighting and color in the city creates a monotonous sterility, like that of a madhouse. Speaking of sterility, we have the next principle: plants. Styles such as biophilic or ecological design are based on evidence regarding the beneficial effects that green surroundings and natural materials have on our health. This we've already covered in the disorientation of Blam, the disorientation of sterility. There are no plants in the city, nothing living that we can see except occasional humans. The second to last principle is sense. Within the context of architecture, our sense of smell is often forgotten, but that's why principles of neuroarchitecture can make us consider things we may have forgotten or overlooked. Now, this one is also pretty laughable. Of course, we can't verify the smell of the city, but if any of the visuals give us any indication of odor, I can't see it smelling great. The last of the principles is curves. Rounded edges help us relax more than sharp angles. This we also covered, with character design being Nihei's only usage of rounded shapes. The city is clearly meant to give off this menacing atmosphere, as it's filled with sharp angles and almost no curved surfaces. This is David Gisson's Subnature, Architecture's Other Environments. In this book, he describes his theory of what he calls subnature. It is described as all of those peripheral and often denigrated forms of nature, envisioned as threatening to inhabitants or to the material formations and ideas that constitute architecture. He divides these forms of nature into three categories: atmospheres, including dankness, smoke, gas, and exhaust; matter, including dust, puddles, mud, and debris; and life, including weeds, insects, pigeons, and crowds. In a paper titled Nihei Tsutomu and the Poetics of Space, Notes Towards a Cyberpunk Ecology, Keith Leslie Johnson writes, quote, From this perspective, Nihei's worlds essentially imagine the ascendance of subnatures, biozones divided by infrastructure, access tunnels, exhaust and electronics ports, leaking derelict water mains, mingling with cooling liquids, contaminated runoffs, in other words, all that is inherently uncontrollable, filthy, and fearsome. Nihei, like Gissen, does not set out to revel in decay as such, but rather to challenge the reductive and naturalistic aspects of architecture-nature dynamics in order to promote a dialectic that radically rethinks both architecture and nature. Such a notion puts to the question humanist assumptions about architecture and nature both. For Nihei, the world is alive in its deadness, but it does not necessarily live for us." End quote. Mr. Johnson puts it wonderfully. Nihei Tsutomu's Blam takes a non-humanist approach to architecture and instead focuses on the ascendance of subnature, creating a wholly different kind of space, one that isn't anthropocentric like most, if not all, architecture, but one that is devoted to its subnatures. In 1958, French philosopher Gaston Bachelard wrote The Poetics of Space, a phenomenological study of architecture, essentially focusing on the personal, emotional response to buildings both real and imagined. The term phenomenology derives from the Greek phenomenon, that which appears, and logos, study, the study of the subjective and personal experience of things. Bachelard shifted the focus of architecture from that of the functional and rational to its emotional and imaginative dimensions, how structures make us feel. In The Poetics of Space, Bachelard wrote, "It would seem then that it is through their immensity that the space of intimacy and world space blend. When human solitude deepens, then the two immensities touch and become identical. A space of intimacy is, for example, a quiet room or cabin all to your own. And by world space, he means sublime conceptualizations of space, like those found in romantic poetry. These two seemingly opposite concepts come together in strange ways, and one of those Bachelard proposes is immensity. Think of, for example, sitting in a vast cathedral. It should not feel like an intimate space being so large, and yet, through this immensity, it creates a kind of gravity, or I should say a kind of gravitas, which conveys a feeling of the sublime, and in such a way, creates its own intimacy. The spatial and temporal scales Nihei employs, particularly in Blam, are so incomprehensible as to defy human understanding. Johnson writes that the result of these scalar distortions is a space-time which simply cannot be processed in physical terms, which must either be transposed onto some relative human metric or sublimed, i.e. recast as spiritual or psychological metaphor, as thought figure. In their very immensity, such distorted spaces become strangely private and contemplative. Now, I think the sublime would have been the most prevalent of feelings, if it were not so vast as to be unimaginable. This, instead of creating the sublime, promotes the effect of dread. This leads me, finally, to mention the vast array of styles present in Nihei's architecture, which also creates this dread effect. Traditional Japanese, Greco-Roman, Gothic, Bauhaus, Brutalist, and so on. The museum of architectural styles he employs denatures architecture, creating an inhuman atmosphere. Posthumanism as a byproduct of space and architecture. Anti-anthropocentric architecture, where humans must adapt to their space and not the other way around. Not an architecture built and fitted personally for them. The result of this, again, is not a testament to human ingenuity, but a pervading sense of subversive dread of the inhuman.
I am a speculative architect, and I think what that means is that I'm still operating as an architect, but I don't design or make physical buildings, but rather I tell stories about the global, urban, and architectural implications of emerging technologies.
This is Leon Battista Alberti, a 15th century artist, author, and architect. In his thesis, Cody Ferran writes, Leon Battista Alberti understood drawing as the embodiment of architectural ideas, distinctly separate from the reality of its structure. In other words, Alberti understood that drawing could capture abstract and conceptual ideas that buildings could not. Drawing can inhabit the impossible, and the impossible allows architects to speculate on what may be possible. As the ones responsible for shaping our future and its cities, it is important that architects venture into the impossible so they might speculate on the future." End quote. This is where speculative architecture may have begun. The idea that through drawing we could speculate and essentially theorycraft new forms of architecture that would be impossible or near impossible to embody otherwise. It allows architects to experiment and produce architecture of imagination and the future. Speculative architecture explores possible futures and alternative scenarios in built environments, using it as a tool to challenge current practices and inspire innovation in design, technology, and social issues like sustainability and urbanization. Speculative architecture gives us a unique insight into these worlds Nihei has created, because Nihei himself is very clearly world building through architecture. Now, let's explore some speculative architecture to see what it's capable of envisioning. This is Planet City by speculative architect Liam Young, a theoretical, hyperdense supercity housing the entirety of humanity's 10 billion people, the projected population of the world in 2050. The idea sprouted in Liam's mind when he discovered biologist Edward O. Wilson's Half-Earth, in which he proposes humanity move to one half of the Earth, leaving the remaining half to nature. This proposition came in the wake of immense problems facing the Earth, the greatest of them being climate change and the loss of habitat and biodiversity, the crisis of extinction of so many living things. Edward Wilson's Half-Earth would protect half the Earth's land and sea to provide sufficient habitat to safeguard the bulk biodiversity, allowing the Earth to continue to breathe. Now, when Liam first heard this idea, he began doing some research and soon came to the realization that you could take this idea of Half-Earth much, much farther.
In its most provocative form, at the intensity of the densest city that already exists, Planet City could occupy as little as 0.02% Earth. So we've been creating Planet City in response to the rising red line on the graph of climate change. Because world building and storytelling can do so much more than just visualize this data. They can help us to dramatize data. So in speculative cities, we can immerse ourselves in the various consequences of the decisions we face today. They can be both cautionary tales or roadmaps to an aspirational future.
Clearly, the works of Nihei are not futures we want to aspire to, but they might just be cautionary tales which portray how untethered expansionism and overconsumption may bring about the extinction of our cities as we know them. This is Carceri d'Invenzione, which is usually translated into imaginary prisons. It is a set of 16 illustrations by Italian artist Giovanni Battista Piranesi in the mid-1700s. All of them depict enormous subterranean vaults with stairs and machines, not unlike Nihei's own work. In his master's thesis, Cody Ferran writes, "In these works, Piranesi illustrates impossible architecture full of spatial paradoxes. His works illustrate interior spaces so big that they more closely resemble exterior spaces, and they blur the line between interior and exterior. Piranesi uses a low viewpoint and diminutive figures to express the vastness of Roman architecture, and this is a clear line that can be drawn to the vastness of Blam, as well as a lot of his other works. Lastly, I want to show Elliot Bishop's The Sweet Proposal, a cautionary tale of the corporate city. In it, the city of York is transformed into a giant Nestle factory, where the entire city is essentially used to produce Nestle sweets. All the residents are in some form or other employees of Nestle, and a form of governance is reproduced by Nestle's executives. It is, in the words of its author, a dystopian corporate utopia. Bishop writes in his thesis, "The Sweet Proposal of Nestle's New York is a satirical cautionary tale of a corporate city-scaled confectionery factory, a critique of city privatization, where the largest corporate infrastructures control our employment, governance, housing, and nutrition. A critique of future corporate dystopias through architecture." This is something that speculative architecture excels at, and it's something that we see clearly in the works of Nihei. Nihei's works include many smaller projects and one-offs, but of his serialized manga, there are 6. In rough order of release, they are Blam, Abara, Biomega, Knights of Sidonia, Aposimz, and Tower Dungeon. With the exception of the last one, Tower Dungeon, which is ongoing, the rest are complete. In the following descriptions of his works, I will often come back to Blam to compare his other works to. This is because most people will likely be familiar with or have even read Blam, so it'll be easier to compare and contrast. Lastly, I want to add that I'll be giving a description of the stories of each of these series, but there will be minimal to no spoilers. I will say, however, that it's pretty impossible to spoil nearly all of these stories, because Nihei has such a unique style, and especially in his earlier work, story is not necessarily the reason you read them. Regardless, I recommend, if any of these series interest you, go and give them a shot. The halls of the city echo like whispering fire, the lightning preempting thunder, sparks flying, shimmering, and dancing in the dark. Pulses of light and sound oscillating ad infinitum, emulating the buzz and hum of a great machine. In this near infinite openness, a man traverses. Kili is his name. Beneath him a pitch blackness where no shadows linger. Nothing to see except the occasional sparks, breathing a sigh of light here and there, like off-dying fireflies. From surrounding fissures, vertical cracks, and channels comes a soft incandescent light, which illuminates the box tenement-like shapes of cold stone and metal, and unknowable machinery sticking out of edges and artificial cavities casually. The corridors of the city widen and contract on whim. Tiny rifts hide the remnants of lost souls. Ever enigmatic corridors shift and change, mirroring relativity. Above, walls vault with cathedral-like immensity. No sky, but a canopy black as night. The city continues on, and on, and on, one pathway to another, bridges, stairs, floors, for what seems like forever. The setting of Blam is this tremendous structure, too massive to even comprehend. After completing Blam in 2003, Nihei started working on his next manga, this time to be serialized in Weekly Young magazine, Biomega. Biomega would later be continued in Ultra Jump from 2006 to 2009. At this time, Nihei also was publishing Abara in Ultra Jump, but it was much shorter, releasing only from May 2005 to March of 2006. These two works after Blam both share that very distinct art and atmosphere of Blam. In Abara, we are told of an unsettling dystopian world that has been devastated by creatures called Ghana. Nihei likes to reuse names, and Ghanas will come up later in some of his other works. But in Abara, Ghanas are these seemingly indestructible, mutated humans who thirst for violence. They eat humans and other Ghanas alike, and their hunger is insatiable. In this future timeline, humans have destroyed Earth's environment and now live in cities connected by a single highway. The most interesting part of Abara is the invention of time travel. These massive structures called mausoleums are time travel machines powered by nuclear reactors. They were created to send humans to the future to ensure humanity's survival. I would continue to describe the story, but if you're interested, you should experience it for yourself. It's a fairly short read compared to his other series. Speaking of other series, we have Biomega. Now, Biomega was a bit of a quandary for me. It tells the story of a zombie virus outbreak from Mars, the virus being the N5S virus, turning people into so-called drones. In this world, we follow Zoichi Kanoi and his AI companion, Fuyu Kanoi. They are both agents sent by Toa Heavy Industries to retrieve humans who are resistant to the N5S virus. Toa Heavy Industries shows up in Blam, but there appears to be no connection. The main antagonists of the series are the Data Recovery Foundation, or DRF. They are also trying to find all humans who have adapted to the N5S virus to create their own immortals, also known as accommodators in the US version. These immortals are essentially superhuman, with incredible regeneration and longevity. The DRF wishes for all humans to be infected by the N5S virus, so that the weak will die off and the remaining will become the new human race. They call this the baptism. Under the umbrella of the DRF, there's the subsidiary Public Health Department, acronymized to PHS, which I assume is just a translation thing. It might be Public Health Service or something similar. But anyways, I found it all incredibly confusing, even more so than Blam. The thing is that in Blam, I got less and less confused the more I read. Blam was shrouded in mystery, but slowly things were revealed. The story was mysterious, and we still had many questions, but the plot was sparse and easy to understand. Biomega, however, had the opposite effect. By the end, I was really grasping at straws, trying to understand the finer details of the plot. Looking back, I'm sure with some more careful reading, it wouldn't have been so bad. But for me, Biomega was intensely verbose, and all the acronyms kind of melded together in my head, and I had trouble connecting characters with their groups and each group's motivations. Nihei himself said that he wasn't much of a storyteller, and that's why Blam was so sparse on dialogue, and contained many panels with just art. This worked for Blam, I think, in the long run. But in Biomega, where Nihei took the opposite approach, I think it backfired a bit. Where in Blam, there are large portions where the story is allowed to breathe and naturally arise through choice encounters. In Biomega, there are long info dumps and expository text, which confused more than added to the story. In terms of art and architecture, these two series right after Blam are still steeped in that biopunk aesthetic. Ghanas in Abara and drones in Biomega both give him ample space to draw the biological horrors which were so pivotal in his earlier work. He also employs the museum of architectural styles and the ascendance of subnatures that is present in Blam. My favorite art from these two works come from the shorter work, Abara. The art of the mausoleums, these truly towering pieces of architecture, piercing the sky, clearly hearken to nuclear cooling towers. This makes perfect sense because we know that the mausoleums are nuclear powered. It brings to mind again the enormity of Nihei's architecture, something he never loses. The scenes he paints are immense through and through, and it is, I believe, his greatest strength as an artist. Nihei's next work would be his first departure from his very distinct earlier style. This is the first manga that feels different, but still retains some of the themes from his earlier work. Knights of Sidonia takes place in the year 3394, on the spaceship Sidonia, one of many ships built to escape Earth after it was destroyed by monstrous shape-shifting aliens called Ghana, the same name that appears in Abara, although these are different creatures. Eventually the Ghana come back and start attacking again, at which point the humans have to defend themselves with these giant space mecha. In Knights of Sidonia, Nihei experiments with much more typical sci-fi story elements. The Sidonia holds a population of about 500,000 humans. Sidonia is essentially a seed ship, a giant settlement in space, a ship containing, for all the characters know, the last remnants of humanity, as they don't know the whereabouts of the other ships. Nihei also experiments with sci-fi tech and bioengineering. Some of the humans aboard the Sidonia have the ability of asexual reproduction, and most are able to photosynthesize, thus not requiring food. Our main protagonist, however, has not been genetically engineered and has none of these abilities, but is still capable and joins the military to help protect Sidonia and its inhabitants from Ghana attacks. Nihei has said in an interview that his inspirations for the series were the novels of Robert A. Heinlein, Space Warrior and Orphan of the Universe. Another very obvious inspiration was Gundam, which he watched growing up. Heinlein's novel Space Warrior is probably a different translation of Heinlein's Space Cadet, which is the English title, a story in which a boy grows up and joins the Interplanetary Patrol to help preserve peace in the solar system. His other novel, Orphans of the Universe, is titled Orphans of the Sky in English. It's Heinlein's story of the Generation Ship, or Seed Ship idea, a huge spaceship transporting an entire community of humans to a destination so distant that generations will pass during its journey. Nihei also said in an interview that going into Knights of Sidonia, he wanted to know what he was writing, story-wise, before starting. His other works were written just flying by the seat of his pants and making things up as he went. But from the feedback he received from his fans this time, he decided to plot a little more in advance. And this is very clearly visible in Knights of Sidonia. It's the first of his series that had a traditionally enjoyable storyline, and even a romance side plot. But there were also some aspects that fans didn't enjoy, seeing it as a large departure from what makes his works great. Like for example, the introduction of a lot more fan service, which was essentially non-existent in his earlier works. Fans believed that what made him different made him great, and that he was giving them something that they couldn't get from other authors. The presentation of architecture in Knights of Sidonia you would think would be limited, as the story were essentially relegated to a spaceship, but Nihei makes it work. The architecture of Sidonia is modern, and still retains that gravitas present in all of his works. Enormous stretches of modern urban structures, utilitarian, yet still granting that sense of awe that comes from sheer scale. Aposimz is one of my personal favorites of Nihei's in terms of art and architecture. It also really harkens back to Nihei's unnerving use of space in Blam. In Aposimz, we're in this frozen wasteland, and Nihei graces us with incredible panels of spacious, snow-covered Arctic. You can practically feel the cold emanating from the page. Then there's also the ubiquitous machinery, again harkening back to the pipes, wires and cables, an incredible artifice of intricate tangles. For me, it's these panels that produce again that Blam-like effect, the overwhelming ascendance of subnatures, and the smothering use of space. The architecture of Aposimz makes an art form out of mechanical utilities. Each pipe, wire, or piece of metal adds layer upon layer of texture to create this mechanical mural of immense complexity, and dare I say, beauty. I'm personally a little more indifferent to the storyline of Aposimz, but it's certainly not a detractor. I'm much more invested in everything else Aposimz does right, and also I have a soft spot for snow and winter, so I feel even more invested in Nihei's portrayal of this frozen, snow-covered world. Nihei borrows a lot of the ideas he's already experimented with and brings them together. The use of space in Blam, the architecture of all his earlier works, the zombie-like N5S disease, and the near-immortal protagonists like Kili and the Black Ghana. This series takes place on a planet called Aposimz. It is much larger than Earth, with a circumference of 200,000 kilometers, where the Earth is only a mere 40,000. 5,000 years ago, the people who lost the war against the inhabitants of the core were exiled to the surface of Aposimz, a harsh winter environment. Surface dwellers had to contend with not only the surface temperatures, but hostile biomechanical creatures known as automatons, and the rapidly spreading frame disease, which turns humans into frames, these zombie-like creatures. There are, however, certain people who use special codes to become what's called regular frames. They're essentially these superhuman beings. Each regular frame we encounter has special abilities of its own, as well as a unique look and color, with our protagonist being blood red. Tower Dungeon is the latest of his works, and from what I've seen, held in pretty high esteem. Many are touting it as the next great dark fantasy manga. Tower Dungeon is still ongoing, and from what I've read so far, I don't really see the hype. I'm somewhat ambivalent about it. It's definitely a fine work, but for me personally, not in the upper echelons like Blam. But remember, all art is subjective, and it's a combination of artist and viewer that makes art possible. No art exists in a vacuum. And if you love Tower Dungeon, all the more power to you. Also, if you are one of these people, I'd love for you to leave a comment and tell me what you like about Tower Dungeon, or honestly any of Nihei's works. I'd love to have a conversation. But anyways, Tower Dungeon is the story of a farmhand by the name of Yuva, who is conscripted into the army to help traverse a monolithic tower, at the top of which is imprisoned the princess who was kidnapped and placed there by the evil necromancer after he assassinated the king. The storyline essentially follows the Chosen One trope we've seen in every shonen manga in existence. But honestly, I can't blame him. It works. Also, he was never the strongest author on story. That's not really what you come to him for. With this latest entry though, I think he really gives us something very different from his other works. This story, if tropey, is still well thought out, and in my opinion much better than most of what we got previously. You can really start to see the progression of his works, and his development as an author. He started off really strong with Blam because Blam was the manga he really wanted to make. Afterwards, he followed it up with works similar to Blam, which never quite reached the heights that Blam did. It's also really hard to compare his works with others, because they're so different. He's a quintessentially polarizing author. You may gravitate to the immense strangeness in his manga, and either keep reading to find out what the actual heck is going on, or drop it because of all its differences. This second response I completely understand. Honestly, it took me quite a while to get interested in it, and it was definitely my curiosity, as well as my interest in architecture, that did a lot of the heavy lifting. I loved all the panels empty of dialogue and filled with just pure space. Vast landscapes and immense structures. The depictions of the city enthralled me in some way, and I just had to know what it was all about. Others with little to no interest in architecture may find it a little dry, but like I said, that's just me. All in all, Tsutomu Nihei's body of work stands as a monumental exploration of scale and the interplay between humanity and the built environment. From Blam, his debut that transforms architecture into both setting and antagonist, to later works like Biomega, Knights of Sidonia, and Aposimz, Nihei consistently pushed the boundaries of space and structure. His towering megastructures and silent protagonists reflect a vision of the future that is both awe-inspiring and unsettling, where technology has outgrown its makers and form dictates existence. Across every series, Nihei's architectural training manifests not just in his aesthetics, but in thematic depth. The spaces his characters inhabit become metaphors for disconnection and the search for identity within overwhelming systems. In tracing Nihei's evolution, As both artist and storyteller, it becomes clear that his works are not merely science fiction. They are architectural meditations on what it means to be human in a world built far beyond our human scale.